A very warm welcome to all of you on behalf of Azim Premji University. We are delighted to present today's program in our series of public lectures which are held here in Bangalore and in Bhopal every month. Public lectures are one of the ways by which the Azim Premji Foundation promotes its vision. And all our public lectures, close to 100 so far, are available on our YouTube channel, and I invite you to view them. I know all of you come to our public lectures because you are well-wishers of Azim Premji University and invested in the education and development of the country. Many of our students from the Bangalore campus are here. I thank all of you. A brief introduction to the speaker and the interlocutor. Professor Michel Danino is a French-born author on Indian civilization. Some of his books are The Lost River on the Trail of the Sarasvati, Indian Culture and India's Future, Sri Aurobindo and India's Rebirth. Since 2011, he has been teaching at IIT Gandhinagar. He has also established its Archaeological Sciences Centre. He was a member of the Indian Council of Historical Research and is currently a member of the National Syllabus and Teaching Learning Material Committee. And that's how we came to know him more closely. And he oversees the preparation of new school textbooks. In 2017, he was awarded the Padma Shri for his work on education and culture. Our public lectures follow a format where we have the speaker deliver their talk, and then one of my colleagues from the university engages the speaker in a short conversation. Today it will be Professor Malini Bhattacharjee. Malini is the Associate Director at the School of Development at our university and is the author of the much acclaimed book, Disaster Relief and the RSS, Resurrecting Religion Through Humanitarianism. A good university, a liberal university like us, should present ideas across the spectrum, and hopefully today's session will be one such. Bit about the program this evening. Soon after this introduction, Michel will deliver his talk for about 50 minutes. Malini will then be in conversation with him for about 20 minutes. And at the end, we expect to have around 15 minutes for audience questions. Please join me in welcoming Professor Michel Danino.
Thank you very much, Swedish, for this introduction. I should thank Azim Premji University, of course. And perhaps I was a bit reckless, but since I happen to have thought a lot about this topic, historical controversies, and I've been engaged in some of them in the past. And I actually enjoy controversies in a kind of perverse way, perhaps. You will understand better what I mean by that in the course of this talk. I thought I should give it a try and kind of sum up my own experience, if I may say so, of how controversies have been handled or mishandled at times, especially in the Indian context. So my thanks to Anurag also for compelling me to do this, or prompting me rather to do this. And I hope that you will understand from the topic, from the title itself, that the talk becomes in itself a kind of a controversy. And, but I will try to do justice to it. And it's more of an invitation towards reflection of what can be done since, and this is my starting point, historical controversies are an inherent part of the discipline. Let me begin with the fact that controversies are not unique to history. They are actually found in almost every academic field. This is just a few days ago. I picked up this article randomly. I have some interest in mathematics. I was once upon a time a keen student of maths. And there are actually lots of controversies also in mathematics. But they are usually very polite and nobody hears about them outside the field. There are more controversies in fields like physics, many more in fields like medicine, and it's an unavoidable part of knowledge. In fact, human knowledge is so designed that there can rarely be finality about it. So therefore, we should acknowledge the existence, unavoidable existence of this field. But when we come to history, we have certain basic components of historical controversies that we should understand. First of all, there's a very deep paradox. And the paradox is that at school level in India so far, and I have had a lot of interactions with schools, given sometimes camps about history, have conducted surveys and so on. And, average schools in India, average students, if you ask them about their history class, you get a number of formula which are very, very unflattering to the discipline, like the sleeping pill. This is how they often describe the history class. Boring, uninteresting, why should we study history, and all these things. So this is, there are, of course, exceptional teachers, there are better schools, so therefore we should not generalize. But if you take the average school in India, history is the least interesting discipline that they can come up with. And yet, it is the discipline that triggers the loudest controversies in the public arena, including, riots sometimes, and which can be quite severe. And therefore, there is a paradox. So why is it that such an uninteresting discipline should be actually something so present and so intense? And the answer is that history is what shapes our identity. Maybe some people can claim that they can shape their identities on their own without having to, acknowledge the part of the past that they are connected to. But these are exceptions, and they are actually, if you scratch the surface, you will find that it is not so. The past lives with us. It lives in us. There's no doubt about it. And we are, in many ways, the inheritors of all kinds of streams. It can be, a genetic stream. It can be a cultural stream. It can be a linguistic stream. It can be all kinds of other components that come to us from the past. Identity is a very, very complex phenomenon. And if you look into yourself, what is your identity? What do you owe it to? How has it been shaped over the years? Then you will realize that it's something that cannot be reduced to very simple elements. But history is a big part of it. And that is why, even though we have so far failed at school to make the discipline interesting, captivating, stimulating for school children, and we hope that in the next few years or few decades, if we don't want to be too optimistic, we hope that this will change. But the point is that it is something that is still at the core of our daily lives, though we may not realize it always. Controversies are inevitable. I've already said it briefly. They are part of knowledge, the way human knowledge develops, grows with methods, even scientific methods sometimes for scientific disciplines. You cannot avoid that there will be different opinions and different approaches to things. So therefore, we should not shun controversies, and in fact, we should desire them. This is my whole point today, that we should know that they are coming and we should make use of them to go deeper into issues and integrate more perspectives and emerge with something perhaps more satisfactory. So let's not imagine that controversies are unique to India. First of all, I can list, of course, any number of controversies worldwide. I've just selected a few to, jog your interest before we turn to India. And every country, in short, has a number of historical controversies, every country in the world. For example, to take something which is actually topical, this is a huge controversy. It has been a huge controversy, not only at the root of the creation of the modern state of Israel, but even among archaeologists within Israel, for example. There's been lots and lots of books on what is known as biblical archaeology. Is there evidence or not that the Jews emigrated from Egypt and moved into Israel as the Bible says? Or is this a concocted story? So I'm not going to, actually I should interrupt myself to say that tonight my purpose is not to give answers to these questions. I'm not actually trying to answer any single controversy whatsoever. I'm just looking at the approaches, the methods, the questions. So therefore, this is something that is actually supposed to have happened possibly 3,500 years ago, if it happened, or at least, let's say, 3,000 years ago, and still is being discussed every day among all kinds of circles, biblical scholars, of course, but also common people who will use these discussions to question or strengthen the legitimacy of the State of Israel. So you can see that this is something which can be of great intensity and topicality. If you turn to the Christian world, there are plenty of controversies. I have just picked this one at random. You must have heard of the Shroud of Turin, which the church always projected as a very genuine imprint of Jesus being brought down from the cross. But when scientific tests were done, they disagreed, and they said that no, it is actually a medieval artifact. Ultimately, the church continued to say that it's a matter of faith and not of science, and the controversy goes on. So again, you can choose your answer, but this is something which we may from a distance find a little strange that so much importance is attached to one object, but for people for whom it is important to their faith, well, it does matter, and the controversy is not yet complete. There are lots of political controversies around this concept of nation. I just touched upon Israel, but you can, all our nations today are, most of them, recent creations. Even if they have a long history behind, the borders are usually recent. The entity, constitutional entity, political entity is recent. The concept of a nation state is a recent concept. 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, it was very different. It was something much more fluid. And, we know that with all kinds of wars, the borders kept shifting this way or that way. So therefore, each nation always tries to hang on to certain icons, figures, to mark the genesis of the nation. And in France, for example, my country of origin, there is often a controversy about, how did France come about? And some nationalistic French people, I take the term nationalist in a very neutral sense, let us say, are keen to project this icon of Joan of Arc as, a paramount embodiment of the French nation to come. So, but others disagree. Some historians are this side, some others are that side, and this has been a pretty heated controversy at times. The American Holocaust, as it has been called by one American historian, in fact, who wrote a book with that title, which is estimated at many, many millions. He himself reaches a figure of 100 million of Native Americans dying as a result of the phenomenon of colonization, not always out of violent military activity. It can be also disease brought in by the Europeans. It can be for all kinds of reasons. But in any case, there is a controversy which will perhaps only keep growing, in fact, because for a long time in the 20th century, these questions were fairly quiet. But the voice of the missing natives is actually getting louder and louder. And this is also triggering the question of reparation. Should the colonial powers, which inflicted so much suffering on the natives, be bound to offer reparation or not? So these are very delicate, touchy questions, because once you accept to give reparation, then of course you create a precedent and other nations also can follow. in fact, this raises the whole question of the legitimacy of these colonial powers, which ended up creating those modern nations that we know by these names, but which basically originate in territory stolen from the natives, and often through violent methods. So this is something that, of course, we know that these countries will not be threatened by these questions, but nevertheless, the fact that they have to admit the past, reintegrate also the proper place and role of the native communities is something which is still very hotly debated currently. One controversy at random, there was, and this most historians agreed upon, a genocide of the Armenian population by the Turks in the beginning of the 20th century, but this is something that the Turkish powers has never accepted. So this is something which reemerges from time to time, and there are many such genocides in Western history in particular, which have met the same fate of being sometimes suppressed, not acknowledged, and therefore controversies follow. What was the use of the atom bomb legitimate to end World War II? I'm not going to discuss this. You have all heard about this question, and it still continues to be asked by historians of the Second World War. Could there have been other ways? Yes or no? This is something that opinions are divided on. Was Tibet ever a part of China, or was it an independent political entity? Of course, China says no, it was not. It was always a part of us, but Tibet, the political powers that were operating in Tibet and headed by the Dalai Lama said that we always were independent, and we have enough historical evidence to prove it. And here you can see how, again, touchy this question can become. It's very burning, of course, for Tibetan refugees worldwide, but it is something also that has impacted, other nations' relationship with China, and this story is perhaps not over. And finally, the big question of how are international borders determined? What is it that determines them? If you look at the world map and borders, for example, in Africa, between countries, borders between the US and Canada, you'll see huge straight lines running for thousands of kilometers. These are obviously artificial borders. And even when they are not artificial, say a border between India and China, what is it that is going to determine it, properly speaking? So, because, there was, of course, a colonial power in between that tried to determine those borders, but what is the legitimacy? Where should we look for criteria to determine these borders fairly? So these are all very important controversies, which is just to set a background of what we are dealing with. And of course, India has a huge share of controversies, and I'm going to run quickly through 15 examples without developing them, of course, because each of them would require hours of development to be properly dealt with. I'm going to pick just 2 or 3 afterwards and focus on them to give a proper example. I think 3 of them. So, the Aryan controversy, that is something which I will take up. Again, not at all in an attempt to answer it, but just to show that there are deep issues of methodology that have not been well understood. Concomitant controversies about this Sarasvati river. Was it a mythical river, as the media always tells us? Are Mahabharata and Ramayana historical texts? This question comes up. And in fact, it's a fairly recent controversy. If you look 100 or 200 years ago, that never existed. It was not something that bothered people. And therefore, as an offshoot, is the Rama Setu human-made. We heard about that enough. Were women oppressed, suppressed in ancient India? There are different opinions. Opinions are sometimes blunt, yes or no, one side or the other, but there are also lots of nuanced opinions in between, and very often the nuanced opinions are the ones worth looking into. Are Buddhism and Jainism part of an extended Hinduism? How do we define Hinduism at all, in fact, to begin with? Is it one family with different cousins in the family, or is it something closer than that? These are actually very deep questions, because you will be led to define what you understand by Buddhism, Jainism, and these isms, which actually come with the whole Western baggage. Another question is whether Hinduism itself is a byproduct of the colonial rule. There are bunches of scholars who argue that Hinduism is a recent imagined concept, which is the direct result of the crystallization of Indian culture seen through the prism of the colonial rule. But is that all there is to it, or is there more to say? So that's also something which could lead us very far. Did St. Thomas come to India? Many opinions about that. Did Islamic invaders destroy thousands of temples? There are lots of studies, pro and con. Was there a Hindu temple under the Babri Masjid? I will deal a little bit with the Ayodhya controversy, but not to answer this question directly. How severe was the Portuguese Inquisition at Goa? This is something that for some people in India remains an interesting question to explore. Did the British rule help or ruin India? There are different opinions. And did they ruin certain things and helped others? Because it's also possible. So these are also, long-held academic controversies and debates. Was the Indian nation created by the British rule? Was there no such thing as India before the colonial rule? This is something that we see, in fact, discussed in a lot of books and even some textbooks. Was Subhash Chandra Bose right to seek Hitler's help? You can see how touchy these things can be. I think that you've got the point by now of the main point that I'm trying to drive towards. And finally, is Mahatma Gandhi the architect of India's freedom? Or if he was not the only one, what role did others play and to what extent, and so on and so forth. So, of course, there will be very different opinions on who you talk to. So, before I look at my 3 examples, I want to stop a little briefly and deal with history itself as a controversy. History itself as being a controversial topic. What do I mean by that? I mean that there is an imagination, or let us say a proposition, that history can be a scientific discipline. In fact, if you look at the original constitution of the Indian Council of Historical Research, it is said that the purpose will be to promote scientific history. When it was created sometime in the 1970s, this was exactly the formula that was used to lay down the foundation of the ICHR. And this is something that itself, to me, is very controversial. So let me start with, this is more, as a matter of comic relief, almost, with certain views on history. Of course, this is not a recent view. This is Voltaire, the French philosopher, and he wrote that history is the lie commonly agreed upon. A typically Voltairean formula, because Voltaire liked, biting irony to make his point. So this is, of course, an extreme view. But if we look at this historian of the 20th century, Will Durant, American historian, who wrote with his wife this monumental 9 volumes on the story of civilization, which is still very, very readable. And he wrote this, which should prompt us to deeper reflection. Our knowledge of any past event is always incomplete, probably inaccurate, beclouded by ambivalent evidence and biased historians, and perhaps distorted by our own patriotic or religious partisanship. Most history is guessing, and the rest is prejudice. Now, coming from a distinguished historian, this is a rather scathing assessment of the discipline. Can we still talk in that case of scientific history? So let me show you another prominent scholar who go by the name of Calvin. I don't know if some of you are familiar with these comics. I personally enjoy them quite a lot. They are very deep things. And this Calvin boy says history is the fiction we invent to pursue it ourselves, that events are knowable, and that life has order and direction. He's supposed to be a first grade school boy. So now let's go back to another scholar of the 20th century, and very distinguished. I'm sure none of you here can identify this picture. I would be very surprised if you could. He's Edmund Leach, who was one of the most prominent anthropologists in Britain in the 20th century. So students of anthropology would have heard his name. And he looks much, much deeper now. And he says the cultural values of Western scholars of the 20th century lead us to believe that good history really records what happened in the past, while bad history does not. But the basis on which we can make this kind of distinction is always very insecure. Bad history is seldom constructed out of fantasy. It is simply that we tend to accept as good history whatever is congenial to our contemporary way of thinking. This is very important. The good history of one generation becomes the bad history of the next. From this point of view, all history is myth, but the converse is not the case. So he doesn't say all history is a myth. He doesn't mean to say that history is a lie, like Voltaire said. He says it's a construction, and a construct is a myth. You're just creating a modern myth of something, whether it's a historical figure, whether it's a happening, whether it's a phenomenon, but it's a construct. And honest historians will acknowledge this, that we know very well that the theoretical models that we use today in history are different from what they were 20, 50 years ago. And after 20, 30 years, they will probably be thrown out of the window themselves, and there will be new models to interpret history. So history is interpreted through a certain vision of the historian, and that is a construct. And that's what Edmund Leach calls myth. It's a cultural construct is a myth, or rather, every myth, in the sense of the positive sense of all the great mythologies of the world, is nothing but a cultural construct. So there is not much difference. It's just that because it's modern, because it's contemporary, we don't recognize that it is a myth. Edmund Leach, by the way, this was in his very last paper. He passed away that same year in 1989, and that paper was entirely dedicated to the Aryan invasion myth. And it's a very profound paper where he shows how, but I'm anticipating perhaps, where he shows how this whole thing is actually the construction of a myth, a modern myth, and should be totally dismantled. It was not something that he was destined to do, but we will talk about it a little later. So to close this preliminary almost, rather history as itself a controversy, we should always keep in mind, and this is important for what follows, that there are inherent, built-in, unavoidable limitations to the discipline of history. First, the material that a historian has to work with, and of course, the more you go back into the past, is extremely limited. The more you go into the past, and the more limited it becomes, and very severely limited. If you're looking at, let's say, early historical India, you don't have 0.1%, or maybe not even 0.01% of the material you would need to assess what you really have to understand, assimilate, interpret, to recreate the society of those times. Because archaeology is extremely incomplete. It deals, first of all, only with a small proportion of physical remains. Only a small proportion of the sites are excavated. And what the public doesn't know is that even the excavated sites, only a small proportion of those sites is really excavated. Sometimes it's just a couple of trenches. So the overall evidence that archaeology can come up with, though very material and in a certain way objective, but not objective in its interpretation, is very severely limited. The same with epigraphy. We have inscriptions, but only a small proportion of them. And when you have an inscription of a king boasting that he has achieved this, achieved that, done this and that for the subjects, how are you sure that this is correct and not just a kind of boast to project a good image of himself for posterity? So there's always a need to interpret. And that is where, of course, the delicate role of the historian comes in, that you have to weigh, the value of the evidence. But you know that the evidence is extremely incomplete. The same with coins also. Then the literary data, which we do have once we come into the historical phase, we don't have it in India in the proto-historical phase because there's no such thing as Harappan literature. And whatever brief inscriptions we have, of course, are still undeciphered. But we have massive literary evidence once we come into the historical phase, and it does help. But it's now well understood that the major pitfall is to believe that this literary evidence, whether it is from a text, purely literary text, say Mahabharata, Ramayana, or whether it is from technical texts, say Arthashastra, to believe that this is trustworthy. And this is something that is now well understood. Again, you will have to filter quite a lot and try to ideally correlate this with other streams of evidence to see to what extent a realistic society is really being described, or is this an idealistic society, or is it another purpose altogether? I will come back to this question shortly. Inadequacies of interpretative models, I've briefly touched upon this. I will not dilate. This is a huge topic in itself. It's about historical theory. We know that models have evolved a lot since the discipline really grew in India in the 18th and 19th centuries. It doesn't mean, by the way, that there was no history before. There were historical chronicles, lots of them in India, well before the colonial rule, of course. But let us say, as a Western discipline, this became with the colonial period in India, and we understand very well now how the interpretative models have been evolving all the time. And what is certain is that they will keep evolving. And therefore, we should be aware that our models of today are just what we have to work with today, and that nothing more. And apart from cultural prejudices, as I said earlier, the cultural framework within which the historian is operating matters. This is something that the great Indian historian of the 20th century, Asim Majumdar, also said. The beginnings of nationalist history in India was not, the point was not to be chauvinistic and sing the glories of ancient India or anything like that. It was to simply provide an Indian perspective on India, because most of the early texts had been written by Europeans. So it's not that those texts were devoid of any value, but they came very much through a strong European lens, which could not be, satisfying for the proper interpretation of Indian civilization. So therefore, the cultural framework in which the historian is operating is itself a limitation, or at least a strong factor. And my conclusion is that there is no such thing as scientific history. Of course, science can be useful to history, and today modern historians use a lot of scientific inputs from, ancient climate, ancient environment, sometimes genetic studies, and so on and so forth. Geology, the whole geography, of course, that is the backdrop of history, and so forth. So scientific inputs, yes, but history is not a science. It is an art much more than a science, and it has to be understood as such. So therefore, objective and biased history is by definition almost impossible. But there can be honest history when you are aware of these limitations and you do your best to really build a picture that respects whatever evidence we have. Now with this, I will quickly go through 3 controversies which have occupied the media and the popular mind, and of course the academic environment and scholars. One is the Aryan imbroglio. So again, I'm not here to provide an answer, because anyway it would be a very long answer, and not a yes or a no. But I want to show how certain approaches have been flawed, and how, if we want to first of all deal with such a question, we should understand what has been wrongly approached and how we should be learning to ask the real questions. So first of all, there were certain conspiracy theories which people who were rushing to deny the Aryan invasion theory, and there have been lots of them, propagated, and you still find them in some books. The first was that the Aryan invasion theory was concocted by the British colonial powers to divide and dominate India. No, not at all. This is completely counterfactual. First of all, the British colonial powers were usually extremely open about what they were doing, open about their motivations. There was hardly any concealment. In fact, they are very easy to read, their intentions and so on. And the Aryan theory did not emerge from the colonial power. It emerged from European linguistics of the late 18th century, where it was understood that Sanskrit and European languages had a common origin, which is what famously William Jones proposed, and which is absolutely correct. Once this was understood, how did you explain that? So then in the early 19th century, with the rise, of course, of colonialism everywhere, especially in India, and the rise of this racial concept of the superiority of the white race, the Aryan race theory, and therefore Aryan spread not only into India, but into Iran and into the whole of Europe and so on, then it became almost a logical consequence of this linguistic theory, coupled with the racial theory so this is very well understood. There's no controversy about that. The genesis of the Aryan myth is very well known. You can read Leon Polyakov, The Aryan Myth, for example, and there's no difficulty about that. So therefore, what the British did was simply to use this, which the linguists had evolved, and then apply it to a racial division of Indian society and communities and so on and so forth. That story also is well known. You can read, for example, Thomas Troutman, Aryans in British India, I think, which is a wonderful study of how the British colonial powers manipulated this theory for their own use. But they were not the creators of it, and there was no secrecy about it. The Sarasvati is a mythical river, so I wrote a whole book about this. I'm always surprised when the media continues to speak of the Sarasvati as mythical. There's absolutely nothing mythical about the descriptions of the Sarasvati River in multiple texts, and in fact its evolution, including its breakdown and ultimate disappearance. It's a very logical sequence. There are physical terms, there are geographical terms also on its location, and it was not a mythical. The only place where Sarasvati is mythical is at Prayag, the Triveni Sangam in UP. Yes, there it's completely a myth in the true sense of the term, a cultural construct, where Sarasvati is brought in and associated with Ganga and Yamuna so that its memory will not, disappear. So this is a myth in the genuine sense of the term, not in this sense. But the Vedic Sarasvati is well understood, and I'll come back to that right now, in the sense that the identification of the earlier Vedic Sarasvati with the Ghaggar-Hakra river, which flows from Haryana into Punjab, Rajasthan, and used to flow beyond. The one conspiracy theory, if I can call it that, and you find this very often reflected in media article, but sometimes in more serious work, is that it is a Hindutva invention. It is not a Hindutva invention. The identification of this river, whether you accept it or not, was made in 1855 by a French geographer called Louis-Vivien de Saint-Martin, who correlated the evidence from the Vedic hymns, which had just been translated in Europe by Max Muller and others, with some topographic surveys of the British in early 19th century, and with local traditions, and put all three together and said, this has to be the relic of the Vedic Sarasvati. So this identification, which was accepted by generations of geographers, geologists after him, and archaeologists, is not at all a Hindutva creation. So first of all, we have to kind of get rid of all these misconceptions if we want at all to approach the real questions. Now, a lot of flawed methodology. Let me give a few quick answers, quick examples, sorry. And I've selected very recent articles to show you that this remains, and these misconceptions completely remain in the public mind. For example, we are just told day before, yesterday in fact, that there's going to be a huge genetic survey of Indian population. It's not the first time. There have been lots of them, but limited in their scope. But there have been lots and lots of them. Now, apparently, there's a bigger one coming. All right, very well. And they will try to extract DNA from skeletons, from Mohenjo-daro and all that, which have been preserved by the Anthropological Survey of India. I'm a bit skeptical how far DNA will be still available in those skeletons, but let us hope that some are still extractable. But then you see this last sentence, which I have underlined. The study claims, now whether this is the journalist or the director of Anthropological Survey of India, we can never quite be sure with our media because sometimes journalists are very free in their reporting. But the study claims to answer the question of whether Aryans migrated to India or not. Now, this to me is a very problematic statement, and that's the statement we always come upon. Where did Aryans originate? We don't even realize that when we say, where did Aryans originate, we are skipping over two fundamental questions. The first is, what do you mean by Aryans? And the second is, what do you mean by originate, and why do they have to originate from somewhere? So these are the questions which actually should be addressed but are not. First of all, and we can see the same thing here. In the Rig Veda, the Indo-Aryan invaders had horses and chariots. So let me answer very briefly that in the Rig Veda, there is no such thing as an Aryan population. There is no such thing as an Aryan clan. There are about 30 clans listed in the Rig Veda, like the Purus and the Kurus and the Bharatas and the Druyus and the Anus and the Turvasas and so on and so forth. There's never an Aryan clan. Doesn't exist. So Arya is not associated with the population. The Aryans, with quotation marks, is a 19th century interpretation of the Rig Veda, which was completely a racial and racist interpretation. And this phenomenon, again, is completely well known. Just read again Polyakov, read Trautmann, and you will see how a misreading of the Rig Veda transformed it into a battle between two races, the incoming fair-skinned Aryans and the indigenous dark-skinned natives. So this is something which good scholars, whether or not they defend the theory or accept or reject the theory, good scholars have rejected. But we still have a lot of scholars who insist on these concepts. And this is problematic. See, there is no such concept, not only of the Aryans, but also of invasion in the Rig Veda, not a single passage referring to an invasion. So this is problematic, especially when it comes from people who are supposed to be piloting, pioneering studies. In this case, David Reich from Harvard, who is doing genetic studies of ancient populations. Another example here, that in the Rig Veda, I should have closed the bracket, the newly arrived Indo-European language speakers called themselves Aryans. Well, no, precisely they did not. I challenge you to find me a single passage where you can show me that they call themselves Aryans. It doesn't exist. It's our reading of the text. So this is problematic. Another example of circularity, because we are now running into the problem of circularity. You are assuming something that the text is saying, and you are building something to confirm it. You see, so you are not actually approaching the text on the basis of the text itself. And here, for example, this is another very recent article by two very good scholars of astronomy who want to prove that the Aryans, again, they will speak of the Aryans, had observed a certain eclipse, which they date to about 4000 BC, and this was in Central Asia, and therefore it confirms that they came through from Central Asia. It's a completely circular argument, because it starts from assuming that they originate in Central Asia. And then they find an eclipse which would have been observable there, and then they say it confirms. Now, if I assume that the Aryans came, I don't know, from, let's say, Tamil Nadu, I can also go and find an eclipse which was observable sometime in Tamil Nadu, and I can publish a similar article. It is just no better than this. The methodology is totally flawed. And we're so used to these flaws that we stop noticing them. So this is problematic. And therefore, I will quote here, one other instance of circularity is the date. Because the date itself is nothing but an assumption. And from this assumption, you start building other dates. But as this scholar, who was a scholar of Buddhism in the 1950s, Edward Thomas, students of Buddhism would have heard his name, noted down, and there's this problem that, we have a consensus that the date should be 1500 BC, and he questions it. He says, at present, we are told that the consensus of opinion is against it, an early date for the Rig Veda, earlier than 1500 BC. What does consensus of opinion mean? It usually means that one or two thinkers have done all the thinking, and that the rest merely take for granted that the authority must be right, and they keep repeating it. So this phenomenon is so visible in the Aryan imbroglio that it takes time to dismantle and get rid of all this, dead wood that is still being carried in all these debates. I think I'm going to skip over this because I have almost touched upon it. The repetition of colonial stereotypes, this racial divide, which is a completely arbitrary reading of the Rig Veda, and which still we find reflected in a lot of texts, including good scholars, very learned scholars, who tell us, for example, that the Aryans came in thundering chariots which would have stricken the local population with a terror similar to that experienced by the Aztecs and Incas upon the arrival of the ironclad horse-riding Spaniards. So you take a model of colonial conquest of the Americas and you transpose it into proto-historical India, 1500 BC, according to your model. What is the validity of such readings? So therefore, we have big issues of methodology, and these have to be solved before we can really come to the core of the real question. I will continue. There are not only mistranslations, but there are inventions. For example, we are told by one scholar that the Aryans, again, came and crossed many rivers. But when you go to the reference of the quoted hymn, you find that it's about one river. There are no hymns saying that the Aryans crossed many rivers. So this is an invention, and this is troublesome because then you have to also start removing that type of dead wood in addition. This is about one word in the Rig Veda which perhaps means ruin. And upon this one word, it is said that the incoming Aryans came upon the ruins of the Harappan cities. So a whole big model is erected about one doubtful word in the entire Rig Veda. And the same for spoked wheel. In fact, the whole deep question about the wheel, the spoked wheel, remains at the core of the Aryan debate, because we are told that the Aryans come with spoked wheel chariots, and this is a new phenomenon in India. I'm coming back to that in a moment. I will skip this. Oh no, it is in fact here. It is exactly what I wanted to discuss, that the horse is supposed to be central to the incoming Aryan. It is his instrument of conquest. But when you look at the Rig Veda, and I published an entire paper where I looked at every single reference to a chariot and a spoked wheel in the Rig Veda, and I found to my surprise that there was not a single passage where together you find the horse-drawn chariot, and the spoked wheel. They are scattered in metaphorical hymns here and there, but they never come together. And yet, we are told that this is the instrument of conquest of the incoming Arya. So there are these big issues which have to be resolved before we come to the crux of the whole problem. In fact, Stephen Bax, a medieval European scholar, reminds us of this issue of mythology. So he's talking about Europe, he's talking about other controversies, but this is exactly what we find here. He says a major methodological danger of starting with such a big theory approach is that the analyst inevitably, and the big theory here is the Aryans came, is that the analyst inevitably feels obliged to select or even massage some of the facts to fit the theory in an attempt to persuade and convince, rather than letting the evidence speak for itself in a more neutral way. This is exactly what we have seen. The Arya imbroglio is something I can dispose of fairly fast, because here we remember the debates that happen, especially those here who are a little bit older will remember very well how in the 1980s and 90s, media, especially in the 1990s, were full of articles with several schools of historians clashing with each other. And this was a very, very intense controversy. But strangely, they never sat down and discussed across a table. And this is one problem we have in India, that these debates happen through intermediaries. We don't agree to sit together and have a civilized, polite debate. It's extremely rare. In fact, and I will digress for half a minute, in the Aryan controversy, because I've been myself involved in it to some extent, I've been part of many seminars, workshops, and so on. And there's only one event which happened in 2018 here in Bangalore, which was piloted by Professor Partha Majumdar, a great fine biologist. Only one event I remember where people from different schools of thought agreed to come together and debate. And the proceedings were published in the Journal of Biosciences. So this was very fruitful and very enriching. But just one debate after decades and decades of controversy. So there's something here where we are not mature enough to be able to sit together and discuss things. Anyhow, here the school of thought that was sometimes called leftist school, Marxist school, JNU school, Aligarh Muslim University school, whatever you want to call it. But there were groups of historians who did sign together a number of documents, and I don't need to name them, you know. And they strangely took certain approaches which were not consistent with what you would expect a historian to do. The first thing that they said is, there is no evidence that Rama was born in Ayodhya, because of course the Hindu side came and said, this is the place where Rama was born for us. And therefore they counted this. When they did this, they did not realize that they were leaving the field of history. It's not the job of a historian to decide whether Rama was born here or there, or even was born at all. It's not a historical question. It's a question of faith and belief and, whatever else you want to call it. It's not something that history can decide. History has absolutely no evidence either for or against the birth of Rama or Krishna or all these figures. There's just no evidence to go by. You can neither prove nor disprove their physical evidence. It's not a historical question. So therefore, they should not have gone into this, because by going into this, they were actually attacking the faith. And they were putting the defenders of the faith further on the defensive. So this was the first strategic error. The second strategic error is that they shifted the argument somewhat, and they said, there's this question of Hindus worshipping at this place, the location of the masjid, as the birthplace of Rama, is just a recent tradition. It is not an ancient tradition. This also was flawed, because there was plenty of evidence that this worship had been going on for centuries. There were testimonies for travelers, there were inscriptions, there were records in all kinds of literary texts, Puranas, for example. So this was something, again, which, of course, this is more of a historical question, but by taking this, and again, they were kind of attacking the faith. And finally, they said there's no evidence that a Hindu temple existed at the site of the Babri Masjid. And the excavations prove that this was a wrong statement and that there was a Hindu temple. Therefore, the Allahabad High Court had no trouble dismantling all their defense. And in fact, they summoned the historians one after another. If you read the judgment, and the historians, in fact, had to confess that they were not experts in these matters. There's a very interesting list of confessions, admissions of the historians who were summoned by the Allahabad High Court. What they could have done instead, and what a few people tried to do, a few intellectuals did try to do, but they were usually not the historians, is to ask the real question, admitting the wrongs of the past, admitting that, yes, we do know that there have been a lot of destructions of temples. There's plenty of archaeological evidence, plenty of smashed statues and so on. Admitting this, question is, how does India as a modern nation come to terms with this? How do we deal with this? We cannot erase the past. We cannot go back and repair the past. So how do we move forward, admitting the past, but in a mature way? So this is what, to me, should have been the national debate. And it was not, because it was eclipsed by all these false questions or wrong questions. So anyhow, this is just my stand on the Ayodhya controversy. And finally, I will briefly, I'm perhaps running a little behind time, but I'll be very brief here. The question, which is actually intimately connected with the Ayodhya controversy, is this question of itihasa, because many Hindus believe that, Ramayana, Mahabharata are itihasa. Itihasa in Sanskrit means it so happened. This thus happened. But in fact, there's a confusion here. Confusion also created by the fact that in Hindi, if you go to a Hindi medium school and you go to a class of history, it is called itihas. And that's troublesome. Another word should have been found for the modern discipline of history. Now, instead of this, if we look really at what itihasa means, we find that it's not history in a modern sense of the term. It is actually, it's not linear history. It is just a mix of historical tradition, of mythology, with a certain purpose. And the purpose is not to delineate a history in the modern European sense of the term. It's not to be a historical narrative, a historical record. It's something different. So what is it? So before I come to that, the question of the Ram Setu is something which happened also very recently. So the question is, if you read the text, it's a beautiful text, and it doesn't matter to you if you read this text, let's say 50 or 100 years ago, whether this Ram Setu is a human creation or not. But this becomes now, with all the controversies, it becomes a burning question. And here we know that we actually know that this is not a human creation. The Ram Setu is not man-made. It is a geological formation which may have had some human maintenance, improvements, and so on. But therefore, it's something that we can answer. This I'm going to skip for today. What I mean to say is that there are good scholars, and I'm just showing here 3 examples, who have tried Shibesh Bhattacharya, Arvind Sharma, Shonalika Kaur, who have tried to bring out the true meaning of itihasa. And itihasa is something that actually seeks to teach dharma. It uses the certain unfolding of events, whether they are embellished, whether they are, there could be, of course, sometimes a historical kernel, but sometimes it could also be something imagined. We don't know, and it will probably never be possible to tell fully because there are no archaeological evidences for these events. So therefore, it's something that creates a story, a narrative. Let's not forget that these are poems. So there is poetry and there is a whole imagination that comes with it. And they have a purpose, which these 3 studies, and there are a few more, have beautifully explained, which is actually to teach the purpose of history. And the purpose of history is ultimately, in this perspective, dharma, to create a dharmic society which will be inspired by the great examples of the heroes in those stories, for example. So itihasa is not history in the modern sense of the term. This is something that at least if we can be mature enough, we will be able to agree upon. This is one controversy which could, I believe, disappear. So how do we make controversies disappear? And I'm concluding with this. First of all, we have to understand that if we are able to handle those controversies well, we'll be then able to draw lessons from the past. We always say history is meant to draw lessons from the past, but we don't do it. We don't do it because we are always blinded by all these prejudices, false conceptions, circular evidences, and so on. And these genuine debates are essential. But what are the conditions under which they can really happen? So let me quickly summarize, and this is my conclusion. First of all, there should be no glorification or demonization of other scholars or either ideologies. We should try to keep the ideologies away and look honestly. I will not say objectively, because I've explained enough that objectivity is not possible because of the way evidence itself is biased. But we should accept that there can be different opinions, and we don't have to demonize or glorify anyone. We don't have enough genuine debates or dialogues. I have said it enough. We have a kind of intellectual untouchability. Here in India, it's not only in India. Please don't think it is. We have here scholars who will never agree to debate with others. He is a Marxist or he is a right-wing person, and that's the end of it. If he's a Marxist, I need not read him. If he's a left-winger or Hindutva scholar, then I don't have to read him. Well, this is not a productive attitude. We should try to clinically identify and reject stereotypes, which are still peopling our literature. And this art, it is an art, it is a technique, it's not a science of collating, weighing, and contextualizing the evidence, looking at the evidence, what it could have meant in that particular context. Asking the real questions. Once you have cleared all this dead wood, then only can the real questions emerge. And accept that the answers can sometimes be multiple. There are things we can answer, there are things we cannot, or we can answer differently in multiple questions. Finally, if there is no possible consensus, when we can, in a civilized manner, agree to disagree. So this is my distillation of my own reflections for many years over some of these controversies. There are, of course, many more. And I'm sorry if I exceeded the time, but I hope you found some food for thought in this. Thank you.
This has been absolutely fascinating, so much food for thought. And I'm going to begin by sharing a little anecdote with all. Well, it's not really an anecdote, but more of an observation while you were speaking, sir. So my daughter goes to a school called Prakriya, which actually means process. And one of the founding philosophies of the school is that if you get the process right, then the outcome is usually right. While hearing you speak today, sir, that for me is the biggest takeaway, right? That if no matter how controversial history is, no matter how controversial certain events or episodes of history can be, if the process of dialogue, if the process of inquiry follows the right process, um, an authentic process, then the outcome will perhaps not go too wrong. Um, I'm sure everyone has a lot of questions to ask. I'll just stick to three, sir, given that we don't have much time. And I want to begin by asking you first about, again, going back to while observing you, I was wondering how easily you happen to talk about not one, but so many important and perhaps even volatile controversies that Indian history has been dotted with so much ease, right? Um, and while some of it obviously has to do with your massive experience, as a historian yourself, but I'm also wondering how important is positionality? And forgive me for saying this, but do you think it's been easier for you to even talk about these issues, given that you're of French origin? Because I don't know how easy it would be for any of us to be talking that easily about any of this.
Maybe it does give me an advantage. I agree. But I would hasten to say that I have met a lot of brilliant historians in India who are, to speak in plain language, neither from the right nor from the left, and actually they're not interested even in taking political stances, and they just are passionate about their topic and they really try to do it well and honestly. They're not necessarily the best known because our media gives more attention to people sometimes who tend to be more noisy on either side of the spectrum, and also gives a false sense that the field is totally polarized. It's not true. There are many genuine historians in India, and they try also to look through all these prejudices, to look through all these limitations of the field. So it's possible also, but then also I have noticed that they hesitate to go sometimes public about these controversies. They would rather avoid them and take non-controversial topics, or if they have to deal with controversial topics, they will try to use a very, very neutral language that is sometimes not so easy to decipher with just subtle hints and so on, because they can suffer otherwise, and I've seen cases happening. So that's my brief answer.
Sure, super. Quickly jumping to the second question, and I'm somebody who's also deeply interested in partition history myself. I've been doing some work recently, and one of the things that I often say is, the very act of remembrance is often an act of privilege, right? And history has a tendency to privilege macro events, which are, of a big scale, and micro histories often get lost to the amnesia of the state, and they seldom even make it to the history textbooks, right? So, is it fair to say that even the paradigm within which these controversies are happening is primarily populated by stakeholders who have access to some form of social cultural capital? Because there are perhaps those who don't even find a chair in that table.
Yes, there are so many silent voices of the past. There are so many voices. In the case of partition, since you mentioned it, at least there are many scholars who have tried really to gather testimonies, who have tried to make those voices heard. But so often, I agree that so often there is a bias in who speaks for whom. And then those who've been involved in those events are not heard. So this is a problem which gets even more severe as you go back in the past, because those voices are generally lost or very, very hard to recover. So sometimes this is where archaeology can fill a little bit of a gap. By some archaeologists have begun specializing on the archaeology of daily life, trying to recreate a bit more of daily life through objects which are non-glamorous.
Right.
There is a glamorous archaeology, the big monuments, the scripts and so on. But there is also a non-glamorous archaeology where you can pay much more attention to minute details which actually are revealing of some aspects of the society that otherwise you just pass over. So yes, there is this difficulty of shifting our focus away from the bigger events which are more attractive, as you said.
Yeah. Sure. Yeah. And finally, and forgive me this, I'm still trying to sort of frame the question in my own head. But while you were speaking, you used the word modern a couple of times, right? And again, going back to the Calvin strip, when one of the things that I caught there was facts that are knowable, right, or knowledge that is knowable, right? And many of us from the social sciences often feel that the modern nation state, right, has a tendency to privilege a certain kind of knowledge form, right, which is factual, which is observable. And there's, along with that, I was recently reading Great Expectations again by Charles Dickens, and the very first paragraph when, this particular headmaster is talking about facts is all I want my students to know. So that utilitarian instinct seems to have, continues to be very dominant in the modern state's approach to even history writing. But I'm sure there existed, before the rise of the modern state, not just in India, but even in other societies. And you briefly touched upon it when you were talking about Itihasa. What are ways to resurrect these indigenous ways of writing history or Itihasa in the context of India?
So this is something I have given a little thought about, and occasionally I think I gave a couple of talks on this. There was this European prejudice that Indians didn't have a sense of history to begin with. And this is often repeated. I mean, we can find very recent writers, intellectuals saying, we Indians never had a sense of history. We had to learn history from Europeans, right? We did not read the Ashokan edicts. It had to be Europeans who came and read them. So we were not, bothered about all of this. Actually, this is not correct. And Arvind Sharma, this book I highlighted, Hinduism and its sense of history, gives elements of answers, and other scholars also have. There were other ways to preserve history. For example, inscriptions, but unfortunately, we still have about 1 lakh of unread inscriptions lying somewhere in Mysore, waiting for epigraphists, and epigraphists are a disappearing breed anyway. That's another problem. There were lots of inscriptions where people, and I'm not talking about royal inscriptions, I'm talking about very humble people recording how they make an offering to a temple of a particular statue, sometimes planting a tree, sometimes trade agreements, grants, land grants, etc., etc. So inscription was one way by which history was, at least some facts were kept. There were others. For example, there were, what we call oral history. So there were all these itinerant communities singing songs, ballads, historical ballads, very strong in states like Rajasthan, Punjab, Gujarat, but other parts of India also, where they sang strong about what was to them historical events. There are even ballads about the so-called mutiny, the first rebellion in 1857. Ballads were constructed and some historians looked at them. There were, and this is fascinating, communities like the Bharots, again of Rajasthan and Gujarat, whose job was to keep register, this is totally non-governmental, registers of births and deaths in communities, and they were traveling again from city to city and revisiting after a few years, and they would knock at every door and taking notes of the of the, the new arrivals and deaths in families and so on. And they had colossal records, which also can help reconstruct parts of history. So there are other ways in which, India has, and in India it's always organic and decentralized, and not dictated by any authority. The king was busy with his own inscription, but the society was working differently. And actually, through all this, you still feel that there is a concern. I'm not even neglecting here historical chronicles, because there are quite a few. From Raja Tarangini to recent chronicles again in North India, there are quite a few historical chronicles. I'm not even talking about this. Even at the mass of the population, it's not correct to say that there is no sense of history, because people were always attached to their ancestry, their lineage. They wanted to know something about their past and take some pride. And of course, the farther you go into the past, the more mythologized it tends to become. But that's another question. But there was this desire to create historical belonging, if you will.
Sure. I'll just end with this, and this is just an extension of what you just said. Oftentimes, these indigenous ways of imagining history are dismissed. Also, not so much because of lack of documentation always, but also because they do not, come up to whatever the given yardstick of, authenticity or objective criteria that the Eurocentric forms of history have, take pride in, right? So my question to you, I guess, is how does one, bring about a sense of rigor when one is trying to decolonize?
I think, first of all, by recognizing all the limitations of the field. This I explained at the beginning. Secondly, by understanding that history is an art, it's not a science. And that, we say social science, it's a misnomer. Social science is a term that originated in 19th century Europe, because everybody wanted to do science. Science was the new God, the new religion. Christianity had been kind of kicked out, and science was going to solve everything. And therefore, those who were doing social science said, we also have to do science. So therefore, the word science was appended to social, but actually it's not a science. Of course, we use a lot of science now, a lot of statistics and a lot of other methods that can be integrated in social science. But it's especially for the historian, it is an art, it is a set of techniques, and there has to be a lot of very delicate assessment of, and sometimes guessing. Will Durant said it. Most of history is guessing. And no, he said most of history is, what was this quotation? Anyway, and the rest is guesswork. Right. So there is a lot of guessing that but there is also honest guessing, where you can try to evaluate some events in ways which, respecting the different possibilities, accepting that some questions need not have a final answer, and looking at all the different possible interpretations. Even physical objects. You see, I could give many examples from archaeology, I won't take time, where archaeology is said to be objective because it deals with physical objects, but it's not objective. It's objective with what it finds, though it finds only a very pitiful percentage of what existed. But it's not objective in its interpretations. I can show you, for one object, you take the Great Bath of Mohenjo-daro, extremely different interpretations among distinguished archaeologists. So therefore, this part of interpreting is fundamental, it's unavoidable, but you have to be aware that you are interpreting. And that maybe you get it wrong, maybe you get it right, or maybe you get it partly right. So this is all what is integrated in what I call honest history.
Right. Or also perhaps what I'm hearing you say is it requires a complete epistemological rehauling, rather than just looking at applying certain techniques or methods to
Yes,
discern objective
certainly,
history.
Certainly.
Sure.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you so much again.